Well, there you go.
Rubbish. I was rubbish.
Colin, another book on Bath. Surely there can't be anything left to write about.
Well, you would think so, but if you're really interested in local history, you keep on looking until you find something new. And a lot of stuff about Georgian Bath in particular is about the sort of glossy surface, the balls and especially through TV and films, it all looks so prim and proper. And luckily I came across some documents which sort of hinted they might show what goes on behind. And these first documents actually were some cash books, some account books. And they just listed everything that a couple spent on when they came to Bath. And they came many times between about 1777 and 1808. And I thought, well, it's interesting. It takes you into the sort of everyday realities of being in Bath. And then other documents came to light, which was, there's not just the cost of, enjoying yourself, enjoying the pleasures in Bath. There's also other costs, because it turned out that much of their money came from colonial sources. That created external costs, social costs, which other people had to bear in order that they could enjoy their time in Bath.
Well, let's start straight away by identifying this couple. And do you know where they came from and how often they came to Bath?
Yeah, they were Jacob and Priscilla Franks. They were from a very complicated family. They were American Anglo-Jewish. And originally their family had come from Hanover and then dispersed around the world, based largely here in the UK. And they were very wealthy. And we know they came to Bath for at least 8 times, because the account book I mentioned actually lists those stays in detail.
Yeah. You make a big thing of how they express their feelings on how Bath changed in that time. I mean, they came 8 times. I don't know over what sort of period that was.
It's a long period, sort of 1777 to 1808, but there's a gap of 20 years in their cash book. So it looks fairly certain they did continue to come to Bath, but we haven't got the details. But it does mean the book looks at how their visits to Bath changed over that period. I mean, at first when they came, it was all based around the assembly rooms and such like. But by the time in the early 1800s, they were getting a bit more, perhaps they were getting older, perhaps Bath had changed, I'm not sure, but the assembly rooms wasn't quite as important. They belonged to the Harmonic Society. They would have private card parties. By the way, they had to hire the furniture for their private card parties, and occasionally they had to pay their landlord extra costs because of the damage that had been caused. So I'm not sure what those parties were like. And of course, also they got older, and probably one of them at least was a lot sicker. And he was a great believer in dry pumping, which hadn't been such a, don't look so odd.
What is dry pumping?
Normally bathing is when you sort of full immersion in hot mineral waters. Dry pumping is basically when you have the mineral water directed at the ailing part of your body.
Okay.
And there would be a pumper, and if I remember correctly, I think it was 6p per 100 pumps. And mostly, I'm assuming it was Jacob who was ill. Mostly he would have 100 pumps directed. Probably had gout, because he died of gout of the stomach. But sometimes he's obviously feeling quite poorly because he had 200, 300, 400 pumps of the mineral water. So this is the person I feel sorry for is the poor old soul
having to do it,
pumping away. Yes.
Oh, so it's like a giant tire inflator. There's something on the floor filled water. And
it wasn't a steam pump; it was a manual pump. And actually, if you look at the old plans of the hot bath, alongside the private dressing rooms, there were dry pumping rooms. So I'm pretty sure that's where he went to have his dry pumping. So I think probably also reflects that the nature of fashionable society at Bath had changed from the 1770s to the 1800s. But the Franks also actually, they started to decide that sea bathing was quite attractive. So they went off on their excursions to Margate and Ramsgate. They moved around a lot.
Well, and there's Weston-super-Mare just down the coast.
Do you know, I'm not sure they ever, they certainly made it to Clifton because that was quite fashionable, whether they made it as far as Weston-super-Mare. But of course, actually, yeah, Weston-super-Mare was just developing as a resort back then.
Well, it offered sea air, if not clean sea. Colin, you mentioned costs. You've mentioned the cost of the dry pumping. What other sort of costs did they have to bear?
Well, basically everything. In the early visits, they had to pay gloves. There were lots of entries for gloves. I thought, surely they can't be buying all this many gloves. And it turns out that gloves is slang for a tip. So if you went on the excursion, you had to pay, say you went to tea in the assembly rooms, you'd have to pay the chairman, but you'd have to pay gloves as well, a tip in other words, as well as your tea. And it transpires that you know, the term evolved because originally people were expected to give people a pair of gloves when they'd been served well, so they're staying at a house, and that sort of just became a general term for tips, basically. But the thing that amused me most on one occasion, they had to pay Mr. Evil of Milsom Street for the hire of a bidet, which I thought was quite sophisticated. I don't think most Airbnbs would provide you with a bidet these days.
You mentioned that they were a wealthy couple and that their money came from colonial sources. A lot of heart searching going on in Bath at the moment about money coming from plantations and the transportation of people against their will to work in them. What did you find out about this couple?
The story does get a bit darker here, although how much they knew about the cost of the sources of their wealth is uncertain. Well, Jacob's father was an American trader generally, but also he was commissary to the British forces, which meant he had the contract for providing all the sort of horses and the food and everything the British Army and America needed. He made a lot of money for that, and he used that to start speculating on Indian lands. So, yeah, the legality was a bit dubious. You know, people weren't supposed to buy territory from the Indians west of the Appalachians, but David Franks actually spent a lot of time buying vast tracts of land. Priscilla's father was Aaron Franks, who was a diamond trader. So he would import coal from Italy into UK, and then export it to India and use the proceeds there to buy diamonds to ship them back to furnish the fine ladies in the assembly rooms. But also he chartered, he was a charterer of East Indiaman ships. So he was very central in the trade between India and the UK. But Aaron also bought Duckenfield Hall sugar plantation in Jamaica, and Jacob and Priscilla inherited it. And luckily, serendipitously, can I say that, we have a series of letters from their estate manager in Jamaica to Jacob, and it's quite revealing because of course it was run by enslaved people, and really it seems Jacob was quite unaware of the realities of sugar plantation industry. So, for example, at one point he complains to his manager that he's simply spending money on improving the enslaved people's houses. They didn't call them enslaved people in those days. And he says, oh, why are you spending money? I'm trying to keep costs down on my plantation. And the estate manager writes back, well, clearly you don't understand. Enslaved people's houses and huts in a sugar plantation are nothing like the sort of domestic cottages with roses that you're imagining. You're imagining it's like it is in England. And he's trying to convince Jacob that it's okay to improve the housing, because basically it costs nothing, because they're just huts and it just needs a few nails and a few bits of board. And it has to be done because they're such poor quality huts. They don't last very long.
It's shocking to read that now.
Yeah, and of course, at this point, the slave trade had been abolished, but slavery itself was still quite important. And actually, the estate manager wrote to Jacob saying, "Well, we've got problems because the birth rate amongst the enslaved people on the estate is going down, and we're no longer able to import new enslaved people from Africa." So and so he carried out an investigation, a very complicated story about he thought that there were the Obeah men who were the sort of animistic religious people were using fetishes and spells to actually cause miscarriages, and it's just a fascinating insight into practicalities. And we don't know how much money the Franks made from their sugar plantation, but a few hints and tips suggest it was quite substantial. Of course, this is a case study, so it doesn't answer the question whether colonial money was at the root of everything that happened in Georgian Regency Bath. But I think, I've also done work on the Indian nabobs, and it must have been a substantial portion, but I think that's probably another book, which I'll probably never get round to writing.
Knowing you will. Finally, where can people buy a copy of The Costs of Pleasure?
Well, it's in most of the bookshops in town. Probably the easiest way is to go on to Hobnob's webpage, and even it's available on Amazon as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.